This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Allison, can you tell me who Father Porter was and what did he do?
He was a priest in the Archdiocese of the Boston area who was when he was a member of the priesthood, was accused of molesting hundreds of young boys and girls in the parishes to which he had been assigned. And he was reassigned in a number of parishes: Fall River, New Bedford, North Attleboro. These are all towns south of Boston area, which are still part of the Archdiocese of Boston. So that's who Father Porter was.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Allison Bass. She's a veteran journalist and author and a journalism professor at West Virginia University. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Allison about her work as a journalist with the Boston Globe and her reporting in the earliest days of covering the priest abuse scandal in Boston. In 1992, Alison Bass was the reporter at the Boston Globe who broke the story about a Massachusetts Catholic priest who was accused of molesting at least 100 altar servers, both boys and girls. This predates the time period that was made famous by the Boston Globe's Spotlight investigative series. That series highlighted the Boston Catholic Church's problem with predators and related cover-ups in the early 2000s. Then, of course, there was the book and then the movie called Spotlight that earned an Academy Award in 2015 for its story about that investigative team. But to more fully appreciate how news reporting of the Catholic Church abuse crisis evolved, it's important to go back to Allison Bass's initial reporting on the issue. Today, Allison Bass joins us to provide some context to the story. Allison, before we talk about your coverage of the priest abuse scandal in Massachusetts, can you tell us about your journalism career as it led up to your work in the early 1990s and some of those historic stories that you covered?
Well, I covered the Father Porter case when I was a reporter for the Boston Globe. I went to the Globe in 1987. Before that, I had worked for the Miami Herald and also for Technology Review magazine, which was a science and technology policy magazine published by MIT. So the Globe hired me actually to cover science and technology, but I was always interested in covering medicine and mental health. So my primary beat when I was tipped off to the Father Porter case was mental health and human behavior. And I had written before that about sexual abuse cases. In fact, I had broken a series of stories about psychiatrists who had sex with their patients and who were obviously not abiding by the Hippocratic Oath because they were exploiting vulnerable patients to have sex with them. So and then I wrote another series of articles about sexual abuse at an exclusive private school in the Boston area. So that's how I came to the attention of the attorney who was representing some of the plaintiffs in the Father Porter case, Eric McLeish. And because he had worked with me on previous stories, I was the one he turned to for the Father Porter story. And this was the first time the Boston Globe wrote about a priest who was accused of molesting young people.
Well, as you mentioned, you were the first reporter, but if people aren't familiar with the Father Porter story, that's understandable, but they may be familiar with the movie Spotlight that won an Academy Award. And it followed your coverage. It followed a lot of coverage of the Father Porter case. That sort of was the precursor to all of the things that happened in that movie and that story. In 1992, nearly 10 years before the Spotlight series ran, you said that you and other reporters followed the Father Porter case. And one of the distinguishing characteristics in that case was that Father Porter was moved from parish to parish That's sort of a pattern, isn't it, in cases like that?
That's correct. And of course, that's what the Spotlight team unearthed with Father Gogin. But again, what happened is that I wrote the first several stories about Father Porter. And then because I was a mental health reporter and they wanted to, several investigative reporters wanted to jump onto the story. So I turned it over to the Metro desk. I think I wrote like 4 or 5 stories. And then I went back to my beat and 2 investigative journalists started looking into the Father Porter story. And they were starting to look into the fact that the Archdiocese had assigned Father Porter kept assigning him to different parishes. And they had sent him to this counseling rehab center in Arizona or New Mexico. They even went down there, and it turned out that he was molesting people down there as well while he was supposedly being rehabilitated. So, and the church officials, both in the Boston area and down there, were doing nothing about it. So they were starting to investigate it, and when things came to a grinding halt, and I can explain what happened.
Well, before we get into that, I did want to ask you about your first stories about this. How did that come about? Can you describe how you heard about it, what your reaction was before you even wrote the story?
Well, it was around 4 p.m. on a weekday, and I get a call from Eric McLeish, and he was an attorney who was representing a number of men and one woman who said that they had been sexually abused by Father Porter when they were children in North Attleboro and Fall River. So, and he said, well, we're going to, the story's going on the evening news, but I wanted the Globe, to also have it. So I basically was scrambling to write it. I mean, this was an important story, and he allowed me to speak to several of the victims who were part of this lawsuit against the Archdiocese. They were suing the Archdiocese because the Archdiocese had allowed Father Porter to be reassigned to parishes, and they felt that the church was responsible for his misdeeds and allowing him to continue those misdeeds. So I wrote the first story under intense deadline pressure, but it was, and then I wrote several others, and it was kind of scary because one of the longtime sacred cows, and what I mean by sacred cows, the special interest that had been protected in the Boston area, was the Catholic Church. And the Boston Globe was very concerned about not alienating the Catholic Church at that time. And so there was, and here I was, a Jewish reporter who was writing about the Catholic Church. So that's fairly scary. And but I continued doing it, and then at that point, the decision was made that we should turn it over to some investigative journalists on the Metro desk. And I have to say, I was relieved.
Why were you relieved?
Well, because I felt like I had a bullseye on my back, because there were a lot of Catholic reporters and editors who were not happy with our coverage. Even before I wrote the Father Porter story, I had written a story. Being the mental health reporter, I covered the American Psychological Association annual conference, and they had an annual conference in Boston, and I got the program ahead of time, and there was an interesting talk by a former priest, Sipes, he had done this research and survey of priests and found that, many priests were not celibate, and that he estimated, and he talked to them about, who they were having sex with, and he estimated that as many as 6% of the priesthood were having sex with underage kids, boys and girls. And so he was presenting this at this APA conference in Boston, and I went and I wrote about it, and because this was research and valid, research that I felt needed to, be shared with our readership. And I remember that at the Globe, there was a fierce debate over whether this story should go on page 1 or not, and with several editors arguing, no, it's just too inflammatory. But to the credit of the executive editor, who was the page 1 editor at the time, Helen Donovan, she said, this is an important story, and we're putting it on page 1, and it did go on page 1. But, there were a lot of people in the newsroom that were not happy with that story, and then were also feeling pressured by the church, particularly when the Father Porter stories came out.
Well, there's an interesting fact about that story that you mentioned, Sipes research. In the movie Spotlight, we know that it's not that way at all. Mark Ruffalo's character is the one who has this dramatic epiphany, and he talks to Sipes and he learns this fact. But what you had mentioned, I think, in one of your blog posts or articles was, in reality, if the movie producers had looked into the information that existed, they would have found your article from years before.
Exactly. And in fact, but it's also some of the, I think, the people who wrote the book Spotlight that and who were interviewed by the producers for the movie, they knew that I had written the page one story about Sipes research, and they chose to, for whatever reason, underplay it. And of course, it's Hollywood, and producers want to make it seem like, their characters, were the ones who discovered all this. And so that's fine. It's just that that wasn't what really happened. All they had to do was look in the morgue, in the archives, and they would have seen my story.
Well, chalk that up to creative license. But there's one thing I did want to ask you about, and it goes back to that first story, or maybe those first few stories, because as a PR person by trade, I'm always trying to convince reporters to either write a story that I want them to write or take a point of view that I'd like to share with them, and hopefully they take it. But when you're a reporter in a newsroom, you have to do the same thing with editors. You're always selling, defending, making a case for your stories. What was it like to make a case for that story, the very first story? Was it a hard sell when you had that story about the lawsuit and those plaintiffs?
Well, I was very lucky. I had an amazing editor, Nils Berzelius. He was the editor of the Health and Science section, and he always had my back. And when I went to him and I said, I just got a call from Eric McLeish, and they're about to break this story. And part of, I think McLeish did it on purpose in that he had already leaked it to the evening, I don't remember which television station, because he wanted to force the Globe's hand. Because if he had come to the Globe first, the Globe, I don't know whether they would have, editors might have buried it. But because the Globe knew it was coming out on the evening newscast, and I told Nils this, he pretty much went to the hires up and said, we got to run this. So, he had a feeling that if he had come to the Globe first without going also to other outlets, that the Globe perhaps might have buried the story. But the fact that it was being released on other news outlets pretty much forced the Globe's hand.
Well, the pressure was on. You mentioned earlier that you were worried about having a target on your back, and we talk about the power of the Catholic Church in Boston. Cardinal Law was the Archbishop of Boston at that time, and we know that he was a critic of the Father Porter case, at least in its beginnings. I don't know if he ever was not a critic of it, but he went through a certain evolution during the period of time when, in the early 90s, when there was that coverage, and until finally the Spotlight Group got a hold of the story. At one point, I read something that he said that the wrath of God should come down on the Globe for its coverage of the case. Is that true?
Absolutely. Somebody covered he was at an anti-violence rally, I think in Dorchester, and there was a reporter there when he called down the wrath of God on the Boston Globe. And we wrote about it because he was furious that the Globe was writing about molesting priests and starting to write about the fact that the church knew about it. And he put a lot of pressure on the Globe, and it actually, the pressure in the 90s did have an effect.
Cardinal Law was the Archbishop of Boston. Now, the Father Porter case that you broke was in the Diocese of Fall River. And at that time, the way the Boston Globe covered it during the 90s was we had basically one priest who victimized all of these other individuals who were now adults. In the Huffington Post piece, you mentioned that the movie didn't do justice to the work that Eric McLeish did. You said it doesn't really explain it doesn't explain the story of 20 priests, why it was buried in those early days. Can you explain more about that?
What happened is that McLeish, had told another reporter, this is after I was already off the story, had told another reporter that there are a lot of priests, it's not just one priest, that this is endemic in the priesthood, and that he, through his work as an attorney, had come across at least 20 priests who were being accused of sexual abuse of minors. But they buried it in the Metro section in the inside pages when that should have been a page one story.
So you had people plowing ahead, you had people writing stories, you had resistance, obviously, and it was not only within the paper, but external forces from outside the paper. There was this fear in Boston that if the Catholic Church turned on you, so would its congregants. And if they turn on you, that's your readership, that's your marketplace. So it was almost a business concern as much as anything. But as you mentioned, there were editors who were also Catholic, so it was a very much muddied situation for the people that worked at the Globe at that time. What was the atmosphere like generally in the newsroom? Were these just spot incidents, or was there this general feeling of tension throughout the newsroom?
I was very protected in that, I worked for the health and science section up until, I think, 96, and our editor did a great job of buffering us for the most part. However, when I became an editor in 96. I went to the Metro desk, and there was stories that you didn't want to pursue because you knew that the editor didn't like them. But, friction, there's always friction in the newsroom. We're all working hard under deadline.
And it comes with the territory, and you do. If you're doing your job right, and I say this as a PR person, you're going to hear from people. You hear from both sides of the story, hopefully. But I had the chance to read some of your stories from the 90s, and I could see that in the course of your coverage of the priest abuse scandal, you had the chance to talk to a lot of the victims. Was there a common thread in the stories that they told you?
The common thread was that he took advantage of the fact that they were good Catholic boys and girls, and that their parents trusted Father Porter implicitly. At one point, one victim said that Father Porter, came to his house and he wanted to, and he said to the parents, I need to talk to Joey or whatever his name was. And they just said, yeah, go talk to Joey. And, they were so trusting of the priests because they looked up to the priests. And when Father Porter came to his bedroom, that's when he molested him. So in many cases, parents, they didn't tell the parents, they were afraid to tell parents. And when they did tell their parents about the abuse, the parents then went to the parish and complained, and they were disbelieved. And, the parish, whoever was head of the parishes basically said, oh, we'll look into it, and then never did.
And then they probably, if there were enough complaints, they would move the priest to another parish. That
Exactly.
seemed to be the pattern.
Yeah.
One person you talked to in 1992 was John Robitaille. He said he remembered what happened to him at the hands of Father Porter when hearing of the legal actions on the radio. He was driving and he heard of this story, and all of a sudden 30 years of repressed memories came back to him. And you talked to him. Was that common or uncommon for the people that you talked to, that repressed memory?
A lot of them. In fact, the very first victim I talked to, and I can't think of his name, also, repressed the memory. If you think about it, you're 10 years old, and it's a horrible experience. You're being sexually abused by a man that you used to admire and respect, a priest, someone who has, a very high stature in the community, and you can't believe it's happening. You don't want to believe it's happening, so you repress it. So this happened to a lot of the victims, yes.
Whatever happened to Father Porter?
He was, because we kept, particularly after the Spotlight series, and even before, our coverage dwindled out. But then in Minnesota, where he moved to Minnesota in the 70s, got married, had kids, but apparently there was some molestation in Minnesota as well, and they charged him criminally. He was never charged criminally in Massachusetts, but in Minnesota he was charged criminally. He ended up going to prison, and he died in prison.
Yeah, I read that he died of cancer in February 2005 at the age of 70.
He should have been incarcerated a lot sooner because he was what we call a real recidivist pedophile. He had this compulsion to abuse young children that he just couldn't control, and he should have been removed from the scene a lot sooner.
I also read about him that when he was a priest, and this was between the years of the early 1950s and 1970s, he actually asked in the 1970s to be removed from the priesthood. But over the course of those years, not only was he transferred from parish to parish, but he also spent at least 2 stints in hospitals to quote-unquote cure him of his affliction. Is that true?
Yes, I know, of one. We reported on one when he was sent to this place. I wouldn't call it a hospital. It was more of a rehab center, and I don't remember whether it was New Mexico or Arizona. But that the sad thing is that he continued to they let him continue his clergy duties at a parish not far from this rehab center, and he continued to molest kids while he was supposedly in treatment. So obviously the treatment wasn't working.
In a story that you wrote in May 1992 for the Globe, you quoted someone from the church, and they said, "The Catholic Church takes the problem of abuse much more seriously now than it did even 5 or 10 years ago, when child abuse was viewed by religious leaders and society as a moral failing. Shaken by repeated disclosures of sexual misconduct among its clergy in recent years, the Catholic Church has instituted a set of recommendations for how each diocese should handle such allegations." So in other words, you wrote a story about the Catholic Church basically saying they understood a problem, they took corrective measures, and those measures were in place and should be working. We can look back, it's 2019, but I have to ask the question, what do you think? Did it work?
No, they didn't take those measures seriously, because in the late 90s, you had these cases like the Father Goguen case, which is what gave rise to the Spotlight investigation. So obviously they weren't taking it as seriously as they should. No.
Allison Bass, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you.
To learn more about Allison Bass and her work on the priest abuse scandal, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook group and a Facebook page you can follow. We're also on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.